Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us here. Women and Children First and A Room of One's Own are proud to co-host a virtual event celebrating Manywhere by Morgan Thomas. For this event, Thomas will be in conversation with Laura Vandenberg. I would like to begin this afternoon by acknowledging that the land on which the bookstore is located is the occupied, unceded, seized territory of the Peoria, Potawatomi, and Miami people. There are over 75,000 Indigenous people of many nations living in Illinois, and we strive to recognize and honor Native histories, literature, and communities. We encourage everyone to learn more about the land on which they are currently viewing this program from. And one place to start is by visiting native-land.ca. My name is Carly Nussbaum, and I work as the Outreach and Sales Liaison for Women and Children First. We and A Room of One's Own up in Madison are a few of only a handful of remaining feminist bookstores in the United States, so thank you for your ongoing support. Our physical bookstore is now reopened. Hooray! But you can also order a copy of Manywhere and more from our website at womenandchildrenfirst.com. Also, hooray! And you can also use the convenient buy a book box at the bottom of your screen. Events are a vital part of our store's mission. And if you're interested in learning more about our events each month, you can sign up for our monthly newsletter or check out our website. You can join us Thursday, February 10th for a poetry reading celebrating the release of All the Flowers Kneeling by Paul Tran, joined by Allison C. Rollins. Now I have the privilege to introduce the authors who will be in conversation tonight. And as a reminder, you can ask questions using the Ask a Question feature, also at the bottom of your screen. Very convenient. Laura Vandenberg is the author of the story collections What the World Will Look Like When All the Water Leaves Us, The Isle of Youth, and I Hold a Wolf by the Ears, which was named one of the 10 best fiction books of 2020 by Time, and the novels Find Me and The Third Hotel. She is the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Strauss Living Award, and a Rosenthal Family Foundation Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the Bard Fiction Prize, a Penn O. Henry Award, and a MacDowell Colony Fellowship, and is a two-time finalist for the Frank O'Connor International Short Story Award. Morgan Thomas's work has appeared in The Atlantic, The Kenyon Review, American Short Fiction, Vice, Electric Literature, Plowshares, Them, and Story Quarterly, where their story won the 2019 Fiction Prize. They are the recipient of a Bread Loaf Work-Study Grant, a Fulbright Grant, the Penny Wilkes Scholarship in Writing and the Environment, and the winner of the inaugural Southern Studies Fellowship in Arts and Letters. They have also received fellowships from the Sewanee Writers Conference and the Arctic Circle. A graduate of the University of Oregon, they live in Portland. Manywhere is a collection of stories that interrogate and embrace questions of identity, gender, and lineage. The yearnings of the characters are palpable and as solid as the many haunting landscapes they inhabit. I found myself holding my breath as the characters awaited both the fulfillment or dashing of their profound desires. It was absolutely stunning and will stay with me a very long time. And on that note, we have two amazingly accomplished authors here, and I, without further ado, would like to get to the conversation. So please welcome Morgan Thomas and Laura Vandenberg.
Hi everyone out in the virtual dimension. Hi Morgan, I loved Manywhere, and I'm really excited to talk about the stories. But before that happens, I believe that you are going to treat us to a short reading, yes?
Yes, I do have a short 5-minute reading. And I also just wanted to say thank you to these two incredible bookstores for hosting us today. And thank you, Laura, for spending this time today. It's an honor to be in conversation with you. And I will read from the beginning of the short story, Manywhere, the title story. My father walks circles around my kitchen. After 20 laps, he pauses to chart his progress on a road atlas lying open beside the sink, mile by mile. He wears off-trail boots, the laces double-knotted over knee socks. His calves above his socks are bare, smooth as well-oiled pistons. Hey, Dad, where are you walking? He's been walking so long, he's worn the laminate to the floorboards. From the sofa where I write this, I can see the polished boards, the places where he's dusted the floor just by shuffling across it. Hey, Dad, aren't you there yet? Last time I checked his atlas, he was on the long trail north of Ethan's Gap, his progress charted by a trembling black line. That was days ago. By now, I guess he's well into Quebec. He's crossed the St. Lawrence, paused to cool his blistered feet in the river. From the bend in his back, the heel-heavy clump of his boots, I'd bet he's walking uphill. When I stand at the stove to fry gritty bread, he pushes past me without a word, as if I'm a tree or a fence post or an outcropping of rock encroaching on his trail. I'm the child he didn't choose, born to a woman he wasn't planning to marry in the summer of 1992. That year, he walked the picket line, paced the pavement outside Paradise Hotel and Casino. My mother walked with him. When they broke for lunch, he taped her feet, taped across the top of her toes to prevent ball blisters, layered her hot spots with benzoin and petroleum jelly, bathed every sore with a sponge dipped not in water, which would sting the open skin, but in skim milk, pasteurized. This is the memory my mother offered when, as a child, I asked about romance. She offered it as proof of his love, but he taped the feet of everyone who walked the line. They called him Moleskin because he always had it handy. My mother got big with me. She got tired. She got a job at Vintage Pizza, which sat right across from the casino. Her wages paid the bills while he walked. When I was an infant, she kept me strapped in a car seat in the utility closet. When the front was slow, she sat on an upturned bleach bucket and nursed me or pumped. She kept one eye always on the picket line where he paced back and forth. She knew once a man starts walking, it's hard to stop him. They didn't last. When I was 4, my father walked out on her and my mother moved in with her sister, took me along. For years, I didn't see him, we didn't speak. During those years, my father reinvented me. He made me in his image, which is to say, he made me walking, a walking daughter, one who would follow him. He's told me about her, his walking daughter, as he rings my kitchen island. Told me she went to the University of Alabama on a soccer scholarship, led backpacking trips in the summers, studied accounting, married in her 3rd year, never finished her 4th. Now she has a kid and a job at the cutting table at Joann's, sliding a pair of snips up the shear guide for minimum wage. That's not true, I say to him. That's not real. I say this every time he brings her up. It's important to me, keeping him in check, letting him know when he's gone off into delusion or dream. I don't resent his invention of her, but I resent the life he created for her, for me, a life with no room for choice. He's shown me photos to prove she exists, photos of myself from 3 years ago, back when I still looked like a woman, photos I can't stand to look at and certainly don't remember sharing with him. In them, I'm grinning with a toddler in my arms. Isn't that your cousin's kid, I ask him, but he insists it's hers. I'm posing in front of an Oaks cross-section with a man I'd never choose, thick-limbed and unsmiling, a military haircut. Is that my old coworker, I ask? Her husband, my father says. She's not real, I tell him. But part of me always believed in her, or wanted to believe. I waited for her like a banana spider hung between 2 leaves. I kept a full set of my old clothes for her. I kept beer and cigarettes in the cabinet above the fridge because he said those were her go-tos. I prepared to hand him off to her. I'd been living 6 months with my father. It was her turn. I used to wonder if I'd seen her, body surfing in the bay, buying scallops at the public seafood counter. I once bummed a cigarette and a maxi pad off someone in a CVS parking lot who might have been her. Then, 3 days ago, I met her. I saw her sitting at the bar inside Sandshaker, a backpack leaning against her stool. She was sipping a margarita through a straw. I slid in. I bought her a drink. She said, I'm married. I said, I know. We looked similar, same eyes, same pebbling of acne scars on her jaw. She didn't mention this, so neither did I. I didn't ask about the specifics of her life. I had no desire to hear them confirmed. Instead, I asked, did you walk here? I'll stop there.
Oh, thank you so much. That was a stunning reading, and congratulations on this. Yeah, this like really extraordinary collection. And again, I'm super excited to talk more about these stories. So if you're in the audience, Morgan and I are going to talk for a little while, and then we will turn our attention to your questions. So if you have questions as we're going along, please feel free to put them in the Ask a Question box, which is just down at the bottom of your screen. So I thought I maybe would just kind of begin at the beginning with the origins of Manywhere. There was this interview that you did with Electric Literature, where you said that, and this is a quote that I'm reading, all of the driving impulse behind the collection as a whole was a search for ancestry and lineage. And I thought this was such a beautiful point of departure for a book. And I was wondering if you could tell us more about this search and like where it came from and how it evolved over time.
Sure. So when I wrote the first stories that would become Manywhere, I was thinking about and uncertain about my own gender identity and my own sexuality. And I found myself seeking models of gender and sexuality beyond like cisgender and heterosexual folks in my contemporary communities. And at that point in my life, not really finding them, and especially not finding the genderqueer elders, folks who had lived long and fulfilled lives. I think most of the folks that I knew who were genderqueer were around my age. And so I was seeking like lineage and also I think a sort of historical understanding for these identities. I also found myself coming up against narratives that like they were cool or they were a fad, and that was why I was interested in that or thinking about that as it applied to myself. And so I found myself seeking a sort of historical lineage or understanding or grounding for these identities and for my own understanding of myself. And a friend told me about Frank Woodhull, and I found myself reading about Frank Woodhull, finding newspaper interviews about Frank Woodhull, sort of obsessed with this person who inspired the first story in the collection, Taylor Johnson's Lightning Man, and who came through Ellis Island in 1908, and who was gender nonconforming in ways that, like, I don't even know how Frank Woodhull would have thought about gender identity, but in ways that felt like they offered me some sort of kinship. I think I saw myself in Frank Woodhull and was really drawn to that person. And so I started researching more and digging into the archives, and I found other individuals. I found Thomasine Hall, who would later inspire the story about Philippa Cook. I found a really incredible portrait series. It's called To Survive on the Shore, with many different genderqueer and gender nonconforming and trans elders. And this all felt affirming to me. However, I think as the journey continued and my research continued, I also started to feel a little bit of skepticism, especially with regard to historical figures, around my own sense of kinship or resonance. I started to understand that imposing like the genderqueer sort of discourse of the 21st century on someone in 1908 was potentially inaccurate or even inappropriate. And so I think the stories at that point shifted form and took on a sort of layered narration style, which I hope centers not so much like the fact of lineage or like the fact that a gender nonconforming person existed 100 years ago, but rather the search itself and the way that that search like captured me for several years.
Yeah, I mean, that comes through so powerfully in these stories. And that connects to something that I want to ask you about, like the composition of the collection. I am a short story collection nerd. I can't, I always want to hear as much as possible from the writer's POV about like how kind of like collections were put together. If you're in the audience and you view collections out of order, it is in my humble opinion, you should not do that. Because we have ordered them usually in a very deliberate fashion, although I'm sure there's some exceptions. And sort of like speaking to what you were saying about, lineage and finding these kinds of ancestral connections, but also not feeling like you just want to sort of stay parked in the past, right? And dreaming forward and imagining forward. I think that movement gives Manywhere this like wonderful range. So we have temporalities that move from like Jamestown in 1629 to a dystopian future world that is on its way to being well and truly underwater. But at the same time, all of the stories speak to speak to one another, no matter how different the settings. And I'm wondering, what can you share with us about, like, how did you approach putting the collection together once you had all the stories? Like, how did you think about order and shape and the sort of macro arc of the book?
Yeah, I think it felt to me like there was one order and only one order, and then I had to figure out what it was or to sort of find it in the stories. And I tried a lot of different things. One friend told me to approach it like a mixtape, and I think that I did try to like juxtapose stories which felt both in conversation and tonally distinct. I printed out like first and last pages and looked for echoes on a line level in terms of those juxtapositions. And then I think more broadly, I understood that I wanted there to be movement both from history up towards contemporary time, and also from a sort of futile or frustrated searching or desire towards a more realized and affirmed desire. And so I think that those were the two overarching things that I was trying to think about as I was ordering these stories. And then within those, I was thinking about ensuring that there were sort of differences in tone and texture between the stories that were right next to each other. And also thinking about different threads throughout. I think some of the stories are more specifically concerned with ecology and ecological questions. Some are specifically concerned with lineages in myself of whiteness and settler colonization. And then some are very specifically concerned with sort of historical lineages of gender. And so I thought about the way that those different threads were being sort of juxtaposed and interwoven to create a final collection.
Yeah, I love what you're saying too about these sort of, like macro movements or trajectories, and this idea of going from sort of searching with the degree of futility towards a search that has more possibility for fulfillment. And I think that that's, like in story collections, it's like, of course, we're thinking about like the micro arcs like within the stories, but that those larger movements, are really important for a book. Were there any like surprising inclusions or exclusions, like a story that you didn't know that was going to be in there that sort of came in late in the game, or a story where you thought, of course this will be in there, and then once you found that sort of perfect final order, it didn't have a place anymore?
Yeah, Transit was a story that I had written well before I started to think about this collection, at a time when it was during my MFA, so I'd written a lot of stories, and it's the only one that made it into this collection. And I think I went back to it sort of on a whim, just looking for stories that might fit the concerns of Manywhere, and found, to my surprise, a lot of material that felt genderqueer, that was just like slightly below the surface. Like the specific way that like disordered eating is a part of it, and the way that like blue is sort of trapped in between in this liminal space, both in terms of the actual setting and also in terms of their understanding. There's the gong. And so I think that story came into the collection later, and I was not expecting that. And I think it just goes to show the way that I feel like my fiction is always out ahead of me when it comes to my own understanding of myself and my identities.
Oscar, the dog, is just chiming in with his, he has a lot of thoughts about story collections, but no, thank you for that. Thank you for that answer. I wanted to ask about a particular story, That Drowning Place, and get into your relationship to place and the collection's relationship to place a little bit more. And in that story, there's this really striking refrain: "You can't hide from the water forever." Many of these stories take place in the American South, which is, as I say this as someone who's sitting in Florida right now, a part of the country where, our relationship to water and storms and floods and tides is becoming increasingly fraught and perilous. And what can you tell us about just your relationship to place and how it's informed your work, and like the dimensions of sort of landscape that you are especially interested in writing into with these stories?
Yeah, gosh, it's a part of it in so many ways. I think about Southern lineages of settler colonization and slavery and racial violence, which continue into this day. And so I think as a white Southern writer who was a settler, I understood writing Manywhere that I had a responsibility not to look away from those things, especially when they arose during historical research, and also to understand the ways that they are ongoing and not to look away from that within my stories. I also think that the actual landscape of the South, the like fluidity of the landscapes there, are a part of the structure of the stories and the way that I'm thinking about those. I just went back to the Gulf Coast to visit my family in December, and the beaches look completely different than they did when I was there like 8 months before. And I think that that malleability and changeability just becomes a part of the characters' understandings of their environments, and to some extent also of themselves. And I think that that's not accidental. And then I think also that gender and the way that gender is approached in the collection is specific to where these characters are living. And here I think about Blue, especially, again, from the story Transit, who I think has a sort of gender, like a transitory gender identity in that story of like cusp of womanhood with a lot of ambivalence and some dread. And I think like that is a specific understanding of gender that would be different if Blue like was living in a different place potentially, or was living in a different time potentially. And so in that way, gender itself feels inextricable from place and feels locally and regionally specific. And then I think the last thing that I'd say, and these are more just questions that I was thinking about as I was writing Manywhere and continue to think about, is that I think when I was sort of learning how to write in like the academic sphere, I feel like character-driven stories that are approaching a sort of psychological realism were like most of the stories we read, and were sort of how we were taught to approach story. And I'm really interested in thinking about place-driven stories, and also thinking about ecological realism, and ecology being not like nature-based specifically in the terms of like nature being a separate from humanity, but just being a way of centering relationships, so relationships between people, relationships between people and their environment, relationships between people and organisms that are not human. And so I don't think that Manywhere offers like a real answer to those questions. I think they're questions that I'm still thinking about, but in that drowning place especially, I was working within a specific structure and a choral voice, in part to decenter like the specific reality of a single consciousness, and instead to ask what happens when these two communities collide because of white climate-driven migration in the 21st century. So those are some of the ways I was thinking about place in the collection.
Yeah, thank you. I'm interested in what you're saying too, because that also was very much my experience as a student, that there was so much emphasis on psychological realism. It took like some time after, and just also reading different kinds of work that engage the world sort of on different terms. It took me like a really long time to sort of understand that, the story doesn't always kind of reside in like with character. You know what I mean? That there's so many different engines that can propel a story. And I love the term ecological realism too. So that's, yeah. Thinking about also like the landscape of the body, I think that you write bodies and all of their complexities and like the vastness and the specificity so beautifully. And there is this passage from Surrogate, and I'm just going to read like a tiny bit from a character named Brighton, where she says, "She cares about the health of the fetus, but not the person of it. She doesn't love it. It's her body she loves, the accommodation of her muscles. She looks forward to the third trimester, the swollen ankles, the stretch marks, the distension of her abdomen, the physical marks of her capacity, her endurance." And I think that was a moment where Brighton's character became so crystallized for me through these kind of meditations on how Brighton feels about these changes to her body. And there's not like a very particular question here, except, thoughts on bodies. But yeah, I just like love to hear you talk about sort of, how you think about the body in the context of characterization, and, how does a character's relationship to their body inform your understanding of who they are?
Yeah. Here again, I feel like there are many ways I could go. I think I was reading earlier this morning about bioaccumulation and the way that like contaminants from our environments are like absorbed and sort of kept in tissues within our body, which is terrifying. And also, I think, sort of fascinating to me. It suggests there's a sort of chemical or like physical memory that's not accessible, that's actually like within our bodies, and that's saying something about like where we have lived our lives. And so I think that there's that aspect that's present in Surrogate of ecology and landscape and the body as landscape being merged into one. I think though that beyond that, the central way that that body is being approached in these stories is as a place where a sort of internal experience of gender comes up against the environment, maybe, or one's like experiences with being gendered and like assumptions that are made about our bodies. So I think here about the ways that even in sort of our like relatively progressive communities, often there are still like narratives of biological determinism around gender. I think about the ways that people talk about assigned sex. It's almost as though like gender identity, sure, it can be fluid, it can be queer, so be it, but like assigned sex is still binary. And I think about the way that that erases like the 1 in 1,500 people who are assigned intersex at birth, and also erases the way that like assigned sex is in fact a sort of approximation or averaging of these many different layers of identity, right? Things like chromosomes and genitals, and also secondary sex characteristics and hormones, which aren't actually easily defined into two categories. And that I think the ways that we think about these things, this actual like sort of physical approach to sex, it's really limiting for trans folks and for cis folks, for genderqueer folks and for others. And so in that way, I think, and so because of this, like these biologically determined narratives, I think on the other side, confronted with them, I feel like as a genderqueer person who's like worked in public health, I often find myself offering this sort of counter narrative of like, no, gender has nothing to do with the body. It's an internal identity. It has nothing to do with gender expression. It like cannot be assumed. Like it's sort of really delineating it from the body and suggesting that the two are fully separate. And while I understand the need for that narrative sometimes in work around public health or in activism, I think in these stories, I'm really interested in exploring and digging into a different truth, I think a more complex truth, which is that for me as a genderqueer person, like gender and the body are inextricably and really complexly related and tied in ways that I'm not even sure I can fully articulate, but I think the stories are trying and beginning to articulate it. Like I'm regularly misgendered, right, because of assumptions that are made about my body or my voice. I've like punished my body in different ways for failing to fit into certain understandings that I have about what it is to be androgynous. I'm like still sort of wrestling with questions of like pregnancy because I'm interested in that genderqueer experience, and also I distrust reproductive futurity. And so I think there's this sense in which I know as a person, I'm still working to sort of align a comfortable embodiment with my own understanding of gender. And I think the stories of Manywhere feel like a place where I was exploring that question, a question that I think I continue to explore.
Yeah, that was such a beautiful and expansive answer. Thank you. Thank you so much. I think the sort of gift that fiction gives us in some ways is this space where, you know, it can be less about coming to these, you know, definite answers or solutions, and sort of more about like illuminating the questions and all of the sort of complex, you know, strands that run through these questions. And I feel like fiction is kind of like the ultimate tool for, I don't know, like taking apart binaries, and looking at you know, whatever aspect of the world that we're, you know, writing into in a sort of like multifaceted way. And it's held beautifully in the collection's title too, Manywhere, and this idea of like many. So I think I'll ask Morgan 2 more questions for now. I mean, I have lots of questions, so I can keep going, but I think maybe I'll pose a couple more questions to Morgan, and then we'll turn our attention to the audience. So again, a reminder, if you have those questions, drop them in the Ask a Question area, and we'll be sure to get to them. I want to ask you a question sort of like moving in a direction that's like a little bit more crafty. I love the way that you write first person. I'm thinking like there's fantastic, like one of my favorite opening lines comes from the story Bump, and it goes like this. To those who accuse me of immoderate desire, I say, look at the oil executives. And I think like I can feel sort of the velocity of performance that's so often a part of first person. And I can also feel, you know, these kind of like subtle complexities percolating in the background. And I'm wondering, do first person stories like come about differently for you? Like I often feel when I write in the first person that I am sort of channeling almost. Like I really do, you know, it's like I experience like a voice sort of moving through me, and I don't feel that way when I write in the third person. It's just sort of like going back to the body, but like this like physical reality of writing in the first person for me is always a little bit different. And I was just curious because I mean the voices in the first person stories were like so sharp, and I was just wondering how they work for you and if they work differently than stories and other perspectives do.
It's really interesting to think about the embodied experience of writing different points of view. I don't think I've thought about that as I was writing, so now I will. Thank you. And I will report back. But I can say that I often write stories in third person first, and then as I revise, find myself revising into first person, often adding a narrative layer. So like an original third person story might be about a secondary character in the final draft, and then we see a piece of of my own sort of gaze, I suppose, that I'm skeptical of or that I want to critique in some way, being given to a narrator who then is offered a sort of first person voice, and then we end up with a first person story in this layered narration. So I think that is often how first person stories come about for me. And then I think within Manywhere specifically, I think one of the reasons this happens is because I'm interested in, especially in the stories in Manywhere, like decentering questions of fact or truth. And so often first person feels like a way to ensure that the focus is on these self-narratives and the way that they're growing out of mythologies and not on specific histories. So for instance, I'm thinking about the story about Philippa Cook, where I'm hoping that for the reader, the sort of like validity or forgery of these letters from the 17th century becomes less important than the narrator's need for these letters to exist and to have a sort of reality, and the way that the narrator's self-understanding is becoming built on these letters, which are like very likely not factual to the time. And I think similarly in Bump, I wanted the reader to be fully inhabiting Louis' experience. And so I think so that even as like secondary characters potentially are unable to see the validity of that experience, the story itself is fundamentally recognizing that validity and is fundamentally sort of allied with Louis and with Louis' understanding of her experience throughout. So I think those are the things that I think about as I write first person stories.
Was there a story in the collection that was particularly difficult for you to write or to finish, or one that just feel like, for me, I have like a problem child story in a collection where I feel intuitively in that sort of indelible, you know, necessary ideal order. Like I know it has a place in there, but also it's hard to kind of get it right. Was there a story like that for you in this collection?
I think that the third person story, Surrogate, perhaps because it didn't have that sort of layering or that voice driven narration, was probably the most difficult. It was the one that I rewrote the most times. And I think essentially it just took me a really long time to figure out how time needed to work in that story and how to put this sort of single moment narrative interspersed with memory. So I would say that is that's the problem child story of Manywhere.
Yeah. And what do you like to do if you get stuck on a story? Are you someone who just sort of tries to kind of work your way through it? Or are you a writer who's like, I need to like close my laptop or put away my notebook, go for a walk? Do you have, what do you do when you get stuck?
I close the laptop. I compose best and problem solve best on a walk, or best in the forest, or like by a creek. There's a lovely little 3-mile path by a creek nearby where I'm living right now in South Carolina. So I will wander down there and then walk for as long as it takes to feel like at least the beginning of a written solution is presenting itself.
Yeah, I love that. I'm also a big fan of walking to problem solve. So this will be my last question for you for now, and then we can go to the audience questions. But I was wondering, like, what works of fiction or just like other works of art, period, were especially important to you when you were working on this collection? Like, what inspired you? What influenced you? What like held you while you were working on these stories?
Yeah, I think there are books without whom I would not have known how to write Manywhere or the stories within Manywhere, and those include River Solomon's and Unkindness of Ghosts, which offered a real embodied genderqueer experience that I hadn't seen on the page before, and therefore helped me with language. Akwaeke Emezi's work, especially Freshwater, which is similarly concerned with lineage, and T. Fleischman's Time as a Thing a Body Moves Through, which is also a really incredible work of fiction that tells, among many other stories, the story of like the universal friend who was a white settler who used like gender neutral pronouns many centuries ago. So I think those were stories that felt concerned with similar questions, those are questions that I was asking within Manywhere, and that especially early on when I was having a really hard time thinking about how to embody these characters, offered me both tools of language and also permission to write the lives of these characters. And then I think structurally, Julia Otsuka's Buddha in the Attic, that choral voice was really influential in that drowning place, which has a similar collective first person. And I also, whenever I'm feeling especially stuck on structure, will just return to Alice Munro and look at the scaffolding of structures within there. So those stories also feel important.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, time, structure. I know Alice Munro is one of my go-to also. But yeah, I think that's such a like critical part of a project sort of journey and evolution too, is finding those books that give us permission or somehow like make our own intentions like even more legible to us. So thank you for sharing what some of those texts were for you. So we have 2 questions in our little question area, and I will read these to you and to the audience. The first one is, did anything unexpected come up while you were writing this collection that you hope to explore further?
That's a lovely question. I think that something that I'm just starting actually in sort of talking about the collection that I hope to explore further is a piece of what I had mentioned about place as it relates to understandings of gender and identity. I think that having just recently returned to the South, to South Carolina from the Northwest, and also now talking about these stories, I'm realizing that the way that I feel affirmed in my gender here in South Carolina is different than the way that I feel affirmed in my gender in Oregon. And that sort of geographical gender fluidity is really interesting to me. And I think it's not something that's fully realized within the stories in Manywhere, and that I hope to explore in future work.
And then our next question, what are your hopes for Manywhere, the book, as it makes its way out into the world?
Thank you first for that question. And I think I just hope that any reader of Manywhere finds within the stories questions of self-narrative and of storytelling and of inherited stories and of mythologies that feel alive to them and that allow them to maybe reconsider or expand their own self-narratives and sense of like possibilities for affirmation.
Yeah, that's an awesome answer. Are you a writer who like, do you think about, I feel like writers have a really different relationship to the audience. You know, some of us sort of like to imagine we're writing into like a void. Others, we might be writing to a specific sort of person or community. John Edgar Wideman has this beautiful, it's like a paragraph, so I won't be able to quote it in full, but he has this beautiful quote when he talks about audience, where he imagines this sort of like pantheon of, you know, writers that he admires and like places that he's lived and communities that he's been a part of. And it's this sort of like choral idea of audience that's both, you know, particular to him and his experiences, but also sort of vast at the same time. And that's, I think, kind of how I tend to think about audience. I love that sort of sentiment. But yeah, how do you think about audience? Do you imagine sort of writing, or when you think about that sort of, you know, we're going to go with a like Wideman-esque idea of this sort of pantheon, if that's resonant for you, like who's in there?
I love that approach to audience. I had not heard that, so thank you. I think that likely applies to my audience, or I think when I consider who I'm writing stories for, I tend to think about like members of my community, queer and trans and genderqueer people in my communities whom I know. I think aspects of like my younger self and that aspect. And then also I think that I feel accountable, I think, to some of the people that I mentioned and the books that I mentioned and other incredible writers who I think have offered stories before me, and feel a sort of sense of desire to contribute to the conversation in a way that I think I just want to say like would make them proud. I don't know. This sort of like desire for like approbation from these writers who maybe many of them are not even alive anymore, but whose stories I think offered me like narratives and self-mythologies that I have needed throughout. And also I think who offered me like community at a time when I maybe wasn't finding it elsewhere. And so I think that those are the things that I think about when I think about audience anywhere.
Yeah, I love that. So I have another question for you to kind of backtrack a little bit to where we started. I had mentioned that interview that you did with Electric Literature, which you had like so many really interesting and insightful things to say about, you know, your work on the stories and about fiction more broadly. And I was really, I have like a long quote from you written down, which I might not read. I'm always a little freaked out when I am like quoted back to myself. Like I could not have possibly said that in exactly that way. So I'll do my best to summarize it, and you can just like set me straight if I get it wrong. But you're sort of, I thought had some really interesting thinking on this idea of lineages and these ancestral connections, and sort of that it can be important to sort of understand them and track back and find these old models. But when it becomes maybe like our primary lens through which we sort of look at or understand the now, it can sort of limit, I think your exact language is limit our ability to imagine the future. And I think that like, I thought that was so interesting because it got me thinking about the relationship between like imagination and change. And I feel like, you know, and of course fiction is kind of like the ultimate space for imagining different realities and sort of dreaming forward in that way. And writing the world, you know, writing the world both as it is and as it was and as it might be or as we wish it might be, and how in a work of fiction, like all of those kind of impulses can exist in the same space and can be kind of compatible in a way. And I was just, like curious to know sort of like your thoughts on that, like reading or interpretation, and also like, was this relationship between imagination and change, you know, on your mind as you worked on the collection?
Mm-hmm. I think to some extent, there are definitely stories, especially stories that I wrote later in the collection, I think here especially a bump, in which I felt myself deliberately reaching for a sort of queer joy and deliberately writing experiences that I didn't expect in that moment to live. So for instance, like having frank conversations with my grandmother about gender identity and transness, or even the sort of relative affluence that Louis has in that story. And so there were elements there where I felt like I was writing into a specific type of trans or genderqueer joy that felt fundamentally speculative. That wasn't something that I was necessarily seeing around me or seeing reflected around me, and that I wanted to put on the page because of that, to try to expand a sort of like the possibilities that are being described and expressed for trans and genderqueer people. But I think more essentially, as I wrote Manywhere, I was thinking about community, I think, and about how a collection might wind up being a sort of chorus of voices that are in community, that are joined by this sort of idea of like a gender expansive identity, even though I think there are many stories in which every character would identify as cis. In each story, in some way, the characters are pushing up against these categorizations of gender. And so I think I was thinking centrally about offering that sort of a broad community within this book. And I think the way that that relates to change is just that I think the futures that I'm most interested in living in and in thinking about and in realizing are futures that are like collectively imagined, I think, or futures that are essentially communal. So in that sense, I think sort of through that lens of community, I think Manywhere is engaged with questions of change and of future imagining.
Yeah, that was an amazing answer. I'm so interested, and I haven't, like, for myself, kind of like thought about a collection in exactly those terms, but as sort of like a kind of communal narrative and a chorus of voices, and sort of a way to collectively tell a bigger story. But yeah, I will carry that with me and keep thinking about it for sure. That's awesome. So if you have more questions for Morgan, please put them in the Ask a Question area, and I will see it and read it, and it will be addressed. And I think until we can kind of check back in on questions at the very end. But Morgan, I think you were going to do another short reading.
Yes, I do have another short reading, which I would be very happy to read now. I'm going backwards. I read the last story. Now this is the beginning of the first story. So this is the beginning of Taylor Johnson's Lightning Man. October 2008. I'm here in the photo booth on Ellis Island, waiting for you, Lightning Man. You're sailing from London on the ocean liner New York. Your ship docks in 1 hour, 100 years ago. We'll miss each other by a century, I know. It doesn't matter to me. I'm here anyway, waiting. I have something to tell you. After you disembark, follow signs to the gift shop. I'm on the first floor, near the water fountains, past the ladies. Make a right at the elevator. The medical ward, where you spent most of your time on the island, is closed to visitors now. The room where you argued your case before the board of special inquiry is locked, visible only through glass windows. But the site where you had your photo taken on Ellis Island is open to tourists, marked by a photo booth. There is still one camera on Ellis Island, and I'm sitting in front of it. I'll meet you here. I'm wearing a Homburg with a stiff brim and a suit just like yours. The tourists mistake me for a living exhibit, a reenactor. Who are you, they ask me. I tell them to guess. I came up on the train, 2 days spent on the rails you once rode the other way. This morning, I told my mother I was taking a ferry to Ellis Island. She said we didn't come that way. It was Canal Street for us. I know. There's no one up there for you, she said, hanging up. But I haven't come looking for family. I've come to meet you, Lightning Man. As this is the lightning rod season, it is the opportune time to put the homeowner on his guard against the wiles of one lightning rod man who is now going his rounds in the lower wards, equipped with a reel of twisted right ribbon, some alleged insulators, a few gilded points and spikes, an enormous quantity of impudent loquacity. From the Louisiana Electrical Review, January 30th, 1909. You protected us from fires. My mother invoked you when the weather turned, when hard rain shorted our window units, when jellyfish sucked up into Gulf Power's turbines fried the circuitry, and we lived for days in the dark, when the generator at the corner of Leon Empire blew, when the neighbor girl dropped her hairdryer into the kitchen sink and the surge protectors tripped one after another down the row of flats, my mother said, "Where's that lightning man?" When a storm tracked up the Gulf to New Orleans, she didn't call on Jesus. She clasped her hands in front of the standing fan and she said, "Hear us, lightning man." We climbed into the bathtub, put the mattress there on top, and hunched against it for breathing room. We listened to shingles pull away from the roof, to the trees outside popping like cans, to the Kesey family next door singing Hosanna, crammed into their tub, same as us. We said, "Come on, lightning man, knock at our door, lightning man, keep us safe, lightning man, we're calling you." After, in the giddy, permissive days following any storm, I used bungee cords for jump ropes. I skipped with the other kids, singing, lightning man, where's your rod?" We tapped Coast Guardsmen on the shoulder to whisper the question and ran, shrieking. We couldn't have said why it was funny, but we were certain it was. We made our own lightning rods. We lashed coat hangers to the gutter. We tied Christmas ornaments to brooms with butcher's twine and dangled them out windows. If the ornament twisted left, a storm was coming. If it twisted right, our mamas were. We all knew your story. We'd heard it from our mothers over dinners of macaroni eaten before the standing fans. The year was 1920. You appeared in a thunderstorm on the porch of the landlord's flat. You held a staff of iron from which hung a crystal ball, the sort used for divination. You knocked. The landlord mistook your knocking for thunder. Perhaps your knocking was thunder. You let the thunder do your knocking for you. You sold lightning rods, iron rods, $1 a foot. The glass balls you'd throw in free. 4 rods would cover the flats, protect them from lightning fires. 40 feet of iron, $40. The landlord refused. The landlord was warded, pimpled, bespectacled, every kind of ugly. The landlord was tight as a mule's ass with his money. 1 year later, the flats caught fire. Inside, 24 people, women and children. 4 rods would have covered the flats, $40. Most of the store with air through their teeth, 1 shake of the head. We may be stingy, but we aren't cheap. My mother went on. You died in 1932, she said. You were entombed in St. Louis Cemetery No. 3, east of New Orleans. The undertaker, when he stripped your body for embalming, discovered you had been all along a woman costumed with a man's suit and a smoker's cough, a Canadian with no US citizenship and no family to speak of. My mother liked your story because she thought it illustrated the progress made by women of her generation. These days, you wouldn't have to hide that way. You could sell a lightning rod wearing a skirt, might sell more. I liked your story because I suspected, even then, you weren't a woman or a man. You were a lightning man with a knock like thunder. I felt close to you.
Thank you so much. We have 2 more questions, and then I think that will be like perfect in terms of time. So I'll go with the first one, which is about character. Many of these characters have such profound desires. How did you navigate their choices as they brushed up against the other people in their world?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I felt strongly as I was writing these stories was that I wanted these characters both to be able to be affirmed in their desires, and I also understood that so often, like, these moments of joy or affirmation or of sort of realizing a specific desire are ephemeral. And so I think often in these stories, we would see a character, like in the story about Philippa Cook, make decisions to really change their life, sort of destroy the life that they were living in search of these letters, of this specific history and lineage, which may or may not be real. And we see this like moment of joy when they leave for that other life and when they're on this ship. And we understand that that moment of joy is like fundamentally ephemeral, that it's very unlikely to last. But still that moment of joy and realization is there. And I think it's also present in the story Bump, right? We see Louis actually be able to live out this experience that is adjacent to pregnancy, as she describes it, and to be affirmed within that desire. And it's true that by the end of the story, she's come up against the lack of understanding in her Nana and her partner. And so we see this sort of loss and this grief, but that grief comes after a period of realization and a period of joy for Louis felt really important to me, because it feels true to me that while like the world doesn't deserve Louis yet, the world isn't ready for Louis yet, I still wanted there to be a point at which that desire was realized and that joy was felt on the page.
All right, and then this last one will close us out. What is bringing us both joy during these winter days?
For me, it's always walks and hikes in the forest, and also the many plants that my partner and I have in this apartment. Yeah, those are always the things that bring me joy.
Yeah. Being in Florida, this is a good time to be in Florida. We will karmically pay for it in the summer, when it's like an inferno and it rains all the time and hurricane season starts and all of that. So, but I think, but I really it feels like a gift to be able to be outside and to go for runs and to feel like I'm not like doing like active like battle with the environment. So being outside has been good. I also was gifted this like lavender body oil over the holidays, and I have to say it has been life-changing. I really believe that it's improving my sleep, and even if it's just Pavlovian, like who cares? But it's, so I thumbs up for lavender body oil.
That sounds incredible.
All right, thank you everyone for being with us. Thank you Women and Children First for hosting us. And thank you, Morgan, for being like so amazing and insightful and generous with your conversation.
Thank you so much, Laura.
Yes, and I want to say one more thank you both so much for this wonderful conversation and for joining us. So everybody knows this video will be available to view again at this link after the event ends, and with closed captioning on YouTube shortly as well. And as a reminder, you can buy the book on our website, and that is the best way to support both the authors tonight and your local feminist bookstores. So thank you so much for attending, and we hope to see you all again really soon. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.